There's been a lot of talk from the right, particularly the Trump wing, about how Donald Trump was so tough on Russia and that Russia didn't invade Ukraine while he was president. But on Meet the Press yesterday, former President Trump's chief advisor on Russia, Fiona Hill, explained why it is what Trump said on that perfect phone call with President Zelensky that matters so much. Take a look.
Well, certainly there was an awful lot done by the administration, also by Congress and by Ambassador Haley herself at the United Nations. But I think that just the one point that sums everything up that you yourself touched on is that President Trump, at a pretty critical period, withheld military assistance to Ukraine that was desperate for us at that particular juncture, basically to get Volodymyr Zelensky to do him a personal favour.
And what message does that send to Putin?
Well, that sends a message to Putin that Ukraine is a plaything for himself as well and for the United States, and that nobody's really serious about protecting Ukraine. And that was ultimately a sign of weakness. It's our political divisions, our partisan infighting, which was on full display there, that Putin, I think, is quite shocked now that we've got some collective action together.
Maureen Dowd's latest piece for the New York Times really kind of breaks it down. It's entitled Zelensky and Trump, Two Performers, One Hero. And she writes in part, quote, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky both played leaders on TV shows and then became leaders in real life. But after they ascended to power, they took on very different roles. Trump became a blackguard. Zelensky donned a white hat. Trump tried to overturn American democracy. Zelensky tried to save Ukrainian democracy. Trump, in a nimbus of selfishness and narcissism, inverted revered American ideals. He soiled the image of his country and reshaped it around his grievances and inadequacies. Zelensky stood up for Ukrainian ideals. He helped imbue his country with a shining, resilient image, reinforced when the world saw remarkable images of battle-ready mothers and grannies making Molotov cocktails. By standing up to the evil empire, Zelensky could earn comparisons to another performer turned Pole, and that should grate on Trump as much as having his vice president turn on him. Ronald Reagan helped lift the Iron Curtain. Zelensky is trying his best to stop it from slamming down again. Let's bring in editor of The New Yorker, David Remnick, and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Emma Ashford. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. Good to have you all with us this morning.
David, I wanted to go back to something that Fiona Hill said, and that is Vladimir Putin's miscalculation from paying too much attention to Donald Trump and the Trump years. This weekend, one of my children said they had never really seen what they're seeing now in class, and that is where people on both sides of the ideological divide, they're no longer debating in social studies two completely different views of the world. She said people are all telling the stories that they're picking up from Ukrainian social media. They're talking about the sunflower seed story. They're talking about the ads. It's really an extraordinary moment, and one that Vladimir Putin and, quite frankly, a lot of Americans probably could not have foreseen. A unified America and a unified NATO.
Well, up to a point, because
right?
Donald Trump doesn't seem part of that unity. You know, for years, we have been quoting Donald Trump on himself, how he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and he would still survive politically. It seems to me axiomatic that Donald Trump's behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine, by, as Fiona Hill said, making Ukraine a plaything, a source of a bribe to enhance his political career, and now calling Putin a genius and showing great admiration for him, then trying to walk that back and talk about having a war with China and Russia. If this doesn't prove him to be not only a fool, and someone who knows nothing about world affairs and cares less, but somebody who's incredibly malevolent about the interests of his own country and the interests of a country trying to ward off invasion, a democratically elected leader trying to ward off invasion, if that doesn't end Donald Trump's political aspirations to run again in 2024, then we as America are truly lost. Truly lost. You can't compare his behavior, his foolishness, his idiocy, and his malevolence to anybody else who's held that office in American history.
Let's talk about Russian history. I had read from Dr. Brzezinski an essay he wrote in '83 describing the Soviet Union in 1983 that sounded an awful lot like Vladimir Putin. Admiral Stavridis came on and said, "I will see your 1983 Soviet Union and raise you Peter the Great." Basically talking about an unbroken line in Russian history from the Tsars all the way to Vladimir Putin, and perhaps Americans shouldn't be quite so shocked. I'm curious, as a man who's dedicated so much of your life to studying Russia and Russian leaders, are we seeing something new with Vladimir Putin, something uniquely meddlesome, or is this just a continuation?
Well, I don't see it as an unbroken line, because I think it'd be hard to compare Mikhail Gorbachev to Putin or to Stalin. These are very, very different temperaments who saw the interests of their countries in a very, very different way. I think, what we're talking about in terms of Putin is courage. That to me seems to be a theme that we have to emphasize. Yes, there are all kinds of historical currents at work here and economic currents at work here, but we're seeing in Zelensky the enormous historical importance of individual courage to therefore inspire a nation. That is important. And where are we going to see courage coming out of Russia? Your previous guests were talking about the oligarchs and so on. These oligarchs are wealthy at the sufferance of Putin. So many people owe their positions and their wealth solely to one man, not to a system, not to a constitution, not to their own efforts, but their ability to get close to the great leader and to curry favor with him. And it is going to be extremely important to see who, and Mike McFaul, I think, had this right, who defects from this system, who says, I'm willing to put up all my millions and my privileges and my power, and I'm going to say no more. Mm-hmm. It is, that's going to be a very important thing in the days and weeks to come.
Emma, I think you've been making such an important point that our viewers, I think you'd really help our viewers understand the Cold War. When people talk about a return to the Cold War, you say that when they're talking about the return to the Cold War, they're probably thinking about late in the Cold War when we had certain safeguards in place, and not the far more dangerous early phases of the Cold War, which we've all heard from our parents about that week during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where people were concerned that nuclear annihilation was just around the corner. And do you suggest that what we're looking at now perhaps is a return to those earlier parts of the Cold War where we didn't have all those safeguards in place?
So it's not a perfect metaphor, right? Nobody should assume we're going back to something that's going to look exactly like the Cold War. There's a lot of differences. But again, we saw that Maureen Dowd column. She's talking about, Reagan, and is Zelensky a metaphor for Reagan? And we're all thinking about that period at the end of the Cold War when arms control negotiations yielded a lot of diplomatic progress, and we actually saw this sort of flowering in U.S.-Russian cooperation and relations. The more analogous period, I think, to what we're seeing today is the late 1940s, the early 1950s, when we see this series of crises, the Berlin crisis, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, each of which had that nuclear dimension and each of which could have gone wrong very badly. And those crises are the reason why the superpowers started to engage in arms control over the following decades. And so, I am worried that the period that we're heading into with Russia is going to be that much more unmanaged crisis where we might see escalation.
And the late 40s, early 50s would seem to be more analogous to now because, of course, even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had members of the Politburo concerned by Khrushchev's actions, by his reaction, and actually he got pushed aside. So there, even with Khrushchev, you actually had checks and balances, which with Putin just doesn't seem to be there, does it?
No, it's a much more centralized administration in Russia. But, you know, the other lesson that I think we should take from those crises is that U.S. leaders were often willing to negotiate with Russia to perhaps give some concessions on our side in order to get concessions on the Russian side. So Cuban Missile Crisis is a great example. We often interpret this as Kennedy, you know, was tough with the Russians and won, but actually we made concessions about Jupiter missiles, you know, in Turkey. So there are ways to take lessons from the Cold War that might help us de-escalate things.
David, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think you make a very important point, and that is that under Brezhnev, yes, Brezhnev was the general secretary of the Communist Party, but he was surrounded by a Politburo that had real power. Same with Khrushchev. The reason Khrushchev was overturned, the reason he was kicked out, and you get this in Khrushchev's memoirs, is that he was surrounded by people who disagreed with him and who wanted him out, and they acted. You do not have necessarily that dynamic here, and it's certainly, and you should tell yourself this every time you hear people predicting this on television, it's certainly not visible to us. So the power dynamics at the very top of the Kremlin are so invisible that the metaphor of him sitting at the end of a 30-foot table, separated from not only foreign visitors, but his own aides, that is a metaphor that should tell you a little bit about the isolation and the personalization of the regime that exists in Russia today and the way decisions are made.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.